Start the. Thank you so much, Val. It is my pleasure to introduce my colleague here at the University of Colorado Boulder, Orit Peleg. I was at an award ceremony a few weeks ago, and she was receiving an award for extraordinary work on governance and life um, among plants and insects. And I just thought immediately this would be an extraordinary thing to bring to the Metagov community. I've been thinking a lot in my own work about how I could learn more from the more than human world. Sometimes I've been walking in the woods or in the mountains here in Colorado, thinking about my work on online governance and just feeling embarrassed that, nowhere around me is there a vote or a parliament or a democracy or anything that or bylaws or any of the kind of constructs I spend so much time working on. And so how can, I'm always asking myself more and more, how can I align, how I think more with how the world around us works. My favorite part, though, about this award ceremony was the person, the eminent administrator giving the award, Tori, joked that, well, those bees probably don't have faculty meetings or committees. And when I went up to her afterward to Orit, she said, well, actually, sometimes they do. um, and so that made me especially curious. But Orit Peleg is an associate professor in the Department of Computer Science here at the University of Colorado Boulder, also associated with the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology and physics, applied math, and also external faculty at the Santa Fe Institute, which is, of course, an extraordinary center for the study of complexity and in a really interdisciplinary way. So that list of affiliations just gives you a sense of the kinds of tools and depth that Orit is approaching this work with. So please take it away. I can't wait to hear what you have to say, and I'll facilitate the Q&A afterward.
All right. Thank you, Nathan, so much for nominating me, inviting me, and now this wonderful introduction. I'm so excited to be here and think about how some of the work we do in my lab relates to what you guys are thinking about in terms of governance. And can you just confirm that you can see my screen and that it's progressing okay? Okay.
Yeah, looks great.
Great. Awesome. So yes, before I dive into some of the work we do in my lab, I'll try to make just a brief introduction to the theme that we work on. And when you think about governance, I think there's always some communication involved, and communication is really the focus of what we do in the lab. We focus on non-humans, although I, of course, find humans fascinating, and hopefully one day I'll also get to think about how all of this is applying to humans. Whether we count humans in this or not, I think that there's many of you can appreciate that there's lots of beautiful ways that animals communicate with each other, lots of different modalities, and many animals didn't just master the ability to communicate in pairs, they're also able to do it in big swarms, where communication becomes really challenging because of issues of signal to noise ratio, etc., that are coming from the density of individuals. So in the lab, we tend to work with these kind of systems, and the example here is honeybee swarms, and I'll talk about this in the next couple of slides. And we try to ask questions about how organisms use a particular signal modality to achieve a certain collective function. How do they integrate the information they get from other individuals in the group, and then make decisions of how to decide themselves, which will eventually all tie into the emergent collective behavior of the entire group. And my background is in physics and computer science, so I tend to think about things like detectability, how to increase signal to noise ratios of some individuals or of a group, how to compress information in an efficient way, and how to make sure that the entire interaction network is robust to, for example, failure of individual nodes. So when Nathan asked me to give this talk, I thought about a few examples from my lab that I think could tie into governance, and I'll show you three quick examples in the next 15 minutes or so. Um, an example with bees related to how they share resources within a group. An example with fireflies, where the collective um, voice of a group is actually coming from really clear interactions between the individuals. And then an example with sunflowers that are maybe not always considered as a conscious being, but they also do some really interesting collective decision making. And I'll keep it at a high level, but I know we also have a lot of time for discussion, so I'm happy to dive into any details as much as you want. Okay, so I'll start with honeybees. And honeybees are a really interesting society. I think I can use that term. There's one queen that she's the one individual in the group that can lay fertilized eggs, so she's really important in that sense. But she's not really telling the bees what to do. She's not giving them instructions and governing them in that sense. Most of the decisions are actually being taken by the worker bees, the female bees that are roughly 80% of the colony, and we're talking about really big numbers. So something like between 20,000 and 80,000 individuals. And I'm not really going to talk about this, but I wanted to throw it out here that one really famous way that bees communicate with each other and make decisions are the waggle dance. And that's really what kind of drove me into working with honeybees. That's how I first heard about communication in insects in general. And there's a really beautiful book written by Thomas Seeley. It's called Serendipitously Honeycomb Democracy, where he talks about all of these really interesting processes and how they forage for particular home, new nest sites, and then the committee that I mentioned to Nathan before comes into place, where they make decisions based on communicating the different nest sites with the waggle dance. So that's one famous example. In my lab, we work on um, other, maybe a bit more subtle, more physical forms of communication. One way is through chemical communication in bees. So they use a lot of pheromones to communicate with each other. And I already mentioned to you that the queen is very important in the sense that she needs to exist in the colony, otherwise they're kind of doomed. And the worker bees would sense the queen based on her pheromones. Pheromones decay very rapidly in time and space. So bees that are further away from the queen has very low chance to find her. So what the worker bees are doing is actually amplifying the signal of the queen using their own pheromones, and it kind of looks like this. So I hope you can you see the movie playing okay?
Yes.
Yes, okay, good. So you can probably see a bee fanning, and this bee is drawing air across her body axis. And then at the very tip of the abdomen, this bee has a pheromone gland. It's called the Nasonov gland. So by fanning its wing, is actually drawing air and moving these pheromones backwards. And that's one unit of signal relaying. When there's many bees who do this, what happens is that whenever there is a particular target, in this case it's the queen, a bee that would sense the pheromones of the queen would start producing her own pheromones, and then another bee that senses these pheromones would start producing her own pheromones and also propagating them backwards So there's this really interesting network of transmitting information through the hive in a way that benefits the bees that are further away from some useful target. In this case, it's the queen. So just to show you a little bit of data, this is an example of an experiment. We're looking at the experiment from the top. The queen is positioned at one of the corners in a little cage, so she cannot really move around, which simplifies the experiment, but the bees can still smell her. And then we put the rest of the bees at the other corner of the experiment. And then every time you see a little arrow here, that's an event of propagating the pheromone signals that I mentioned before. So this is an example of that process. At the beginning of the experiment, there's lots of scenting, lots of communication happening. And then after a while, the bees do find the way to the queen and they aggregate around her. And we did a lot of careful analysis to show that the local communication events really create a global map to the queen. This is a little bit technical, but we basically take every communication event and we treat it as a little gradient that we then integrate into a higher dimensional surface. And I can explain that more later if you want. But the bottom line is that if higher values of that surface coincide with where the target is, then that tells us that these directions that the bees create locally are meaningful. And if we do a control where we take exactly the same data but randomize the direction that the bees are sending, we get a completely flat surface. So this is just to say that the directions that the bees um, transmit the information to is really important here. And we did a bunch of other work to try to understand how more subtle aspects of the communication affect this collective aggregation. The really interesting thing that I wanted to mention here, and it's not yet published, we're working on that paper, is that one of my students, Golnar Garuni Farad, discovered in complete accident that the bees also produce these chemical signals in a different scenario where there's no queen in this experiment. Instead, there's something else useful, which is a bee that has food in her social stomach. So that's a really interesting way in which the bees allow for division of labor. Basically, there's many jobs that the bees can take in the hive, and then some of the bees stay in the hive and some of the bees fly away and they come back with food in their social stomachs. And then they just share it directly with other bees. So the other bees that are doing jobs in the hive don't have to worry about foraging for food. And Golar discovered that when we do this experiment, the bees also use the same communication principle. So right now, in this movie, Golnar is going to add a fed bee that has food to share. Oops, and this movie hopefully will play. So this just to show you that this is also happening in this context. The bees use pheromone communication and a network to communicate with each other that eventually creates a global map to this useful resource. And we also work on trying to understand how the resource is then being distributed most likely homogeneously throughout the colony, and that's also an interesting aspect that I won't talk about now, but I am happy to tell you later. Okay, so that was a quick example about honeybees. The next example that I want to show you is related to another insect, fireflies. And there, the communication is more based on visual signals. And I'll tell you just a little bit about their biology so that you understand what they're maybe trying to achieve here. So fireflies are very beautiful insects. They're maybe the most universally beloved insects within a wide range. They have an organ in their abdomen that allows them to flash cold light. And when you see a firefly flash, it's most likely coming from a mating behavior. So the males would flash a particular flash pattern, and the females would respond also in a flash pattern. And this is all very species specific. So there are many species of fireflies, and every species has its own unique, almost like a Morse code. Every line here is a different species, and the males have a species-specific pattern, and the females also have a species-specific response pattern. So this is kind of cool. And when I saw this, my brain kind of tickled as a computer scientist. This is very similar to other um, some classical problems in computer science that I think we can relate this to. But even with this really simple communication signal, when you have a group of fireflies, and that's what I'm illustrating here in the movie on the right, you cannot really see the fireflies when they're not flashing, so it's completely dark. And it's really hard to connect the dots and say which flash came from which individual, and then potentially, go back to this table and say, oh, okay, it's my species or it's not my species. So it's a complicated problem. One way in which fireflies deal with this problem is by synchronizing their flashes. So this is an example of that behavior. We just saw one burst of synchronous flashes, and then they wait, this particular species wait for a while and then start another burst. And so the pattern of these individuals in the swarm is becoming much more, the signal to noise of this pattern is becoming more easy to interpret. Basically gives them an immediate boost to the signal. So I want to plug in and just say that synchronization is something that happens a lot across nature, actually also with a lot of inanimate things like electrons in a superconductor. That was the first example I came across of synchronization. But also humans, we do a lot of things that are synchronized, like at the end of a concert, we clap. In some cultures, clap in a synchronous way to request an encore. I don't know if any of you experienced that. It's kind of doesn't happen so much in the US, but it happens more in Europe, I think. And another beautiful example from recent work is synchronization of violin players. And, we can reflect this on many different human processes. And if anybody is interested to read more about this, this is a really good book by Steven Strogatz about the math behind all of these synchronization processes. When I learned about synchronization, the directed example was in physics, the electrons that are synchronizing in a superconductor. Our teacher also mentioned fireflies as a more relatable example. And that system really got stuck in my head. It just sounded so beautiful, and turns out that there was very little known about fireflies when I started my own lab in terms of how they synchronize with each other. So we just wanted to get more data and see if we can understand the decision-making rules of fireflies this way. So we go out to the field, usually on the East Coast. This is a recording that we took on the Smoky Mountains. And we have cameras. From the cameras, we can, of course, get some temporal readout of the flashes of the swarm. We can also get spatial readout of the flashes of the swarm when we add a second camera. And we can basically reconstruct where every one of these flashes occur. And then we can start looking at some spatiotemporal processes that are tied into synchronization. So one thing we looked at is this beautiful phenomenon of a wave of synchronous fireflies that kind of passes through the forest. So if I'm standing in the forest, I see flashes that are further away starting, and then closer, and then closer, and then closer, and then they pass me, basically. And using this spatial data, we can visualize it. So to orient you here, we're looking at the system from an aerial view. our cameras are where my cursor is, which I hope you can see at 00. And all of these flashes are now colored by when they started the burst of flashes. So blue means that it started earlier, and red means that it started later. We can also look at individuals within that field of view. And, one hypothesis about these waves was that individuals just move together, in a particular direction. But we were able to show that their motion is, or their speed of direction is actually random. So they're not really moving along the wave. The wave is really created by the social interaction between the fireflies. So that's one thing we learned about the spatial aspect. We're also looking at the temporal aspects. So maybe I'll just show this example here, where we show that the collective pattern that we saw in that video earlier is actually very different from what individuals would produce by themselves. So if here we have a burst of a couple of flashes and then a stop and then a couple of flashes, the time between one burst and the next consecutive burst is very, very variable for an individual firefly. And you can see the distribution of that here at the top plot. And it becomes much more narrow and stereotypic for a group of in this case, 20 fireflies. So we're really interested in that particular local rules of if I'm a firefly, I'm seeing other fireflies flash, how do I respond, and how does that lead to a more punctual collective rhythm. So yeah, I think, do I still have a few minutes to talk about plants? Yeah, okay,
Please.
good.
Bring on the plants.
Awesome. So, okay, so I showed you two examples with insects. The last example that I want to show you is related to plants, which are, I think, also just as beautiful. If we think about a, a plant that is drawing nutrition from the sun, I think the sunflower is also a very good example of that. And I'm not sure if you can see it by eye here, but you can see a lot of crowns of a lot of crowns of the plants themselves. The reason you can see them and there's not too much interference with one plant visually occluding another plant, there is some of this here, but to the most part, the plants are actually able to perceive when they're being shaded by another plant. And that's fascinating. I mean, the light that comes through a plant tissue comes out of that plant tissue with a different spectrum, and then plants respond to that different spectrum in different ways. So what we wanted to do here was to try to understand how sunflowers arrange themselves in a way that helps the entire group acquire nutrition from the sun by minimizing the shading that they impose on each other. And that was in a collaboration with the lab of Yasmin Meroz from Tel Aviv University. Yasmin did these experiments where she grew a bunch of sunflower seeds in a fairly dense environment along a particular, basically a line. So there are 5 plants here along a line. And through this movie, you can see that there's a lot of motion. There's actually, this motion usually thought of as a particular search process. Circummutation is the technical name. So plants like cucumber seedlings that are vines and would climb on things would also do this, and this is maybe helping them to find something to cling on. For the sunflower, we think it's a new usage of these random motions to minimize some cost for the group. So Yasmin did these experiments. My lab did some simulations where we treat the crowns of the plants as little spheres, and we introduce the forces that repel one plant from another based on shading. So the simulation kind of looks like this. We start with the same arrangement of plants, and then we let them grow. And we see how different arrangements of the final size of the crowns affect the shading. So this is a bit of a complicated plot, but I'll walk you through it because I think it's really interesting. Let's just forget about the black line, but just focus on the red line. The y-axis here is showing us how much shading there is between the plants. And the x-axis is telling us how much random motion the plants experience in the simulation. So we can see that this function has a minimum somewhere. That's probably where we want to be if we want to minimize shading. And in the simulation, we see that there are a couple of regimes. So if there's very little noise, the plants really just stay on their line and they not able to escape something that we refer to as a local minima. If there's a lot of random noise, then that basically overwhelms all the other interactions we have in the system. And then there is this sweet spot of just the right amount of noise in terms of the motion of the plants that allows them to create these zigzag pattern that also minimize the shading. And I think this is really interesting because noise in systems tend to be thought negatively of, but this is actually a functional noise where it's helping the system to overcome some energetic barriers and reach a more optimal state for the entire group. So this is very briefly some examples from my lab. I also included some references here of the problem of the bees and how they use chemical communication to signal other bees to know, hey, there's something useful here. It could be the queen, it could be a food source, etc. Fireflies that interact with each other to create a collective pattern. And the last example we saw of plants. I think maybe the unifying theme here is that there's no single leader. And all of these decisions, to the best of our knowledge, are coming from interactions and opinions within many of the individuals. And the way they integrate together is how the group makes decisions as a group. And so finally, I'll just say that everything I showed you was a combined effort of many, many people, postdocs, graduate students, beekeepers, undergrads, collaborators, and the help from several funding agencies. So I'll put this here, and I think I'll stop and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much. What an amazing start. And please put your questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand. I just want to selfishly start out with a question. You're in a computer science department. You have an incredibly interdisciplinary background. That's only one part of your the kind of fields you work in. But I wonder if you could just compare a bit, since a lot of people here are familiar working with computer systems, how useful you find parallels between, say, concepts of protocol in computer systems around signaling in comparison to these. Do you see parallels, useful parallels between the design of computer systems and these kinds of processes you've described, or do you think it's more useful to approach them with a different frame? Do you find that metaphor, that comparison, maybe hides more than it reveals?
So, first of all, I think it's always useful to reflect on similar problems in different fields that look at it from a different perspective. I think that in all the systems that I showed you today, it's a problem it's a biological system, and this biological system doesn't really care about our man-made disciplines boundaries. So in my view, I kind of try to take whatever method necessary to try to understand that problem. And then maybe a more subtle aspect is that whenever we see an analogy between the biological system and how it's processing information or making decisions to an inanimate system, maybe that's more coming from physics, or maybe a computational algorithm approach that also has, of course, some limits to its efficiency. Then it's really interesting to use those to decouple what the biological system is um, just kind of it's the best way to put it, subjected to. So the biological system is going to be subjected to the same physical rules as any other system, and the same maybe computational principles as any other system. But then usually it's doing something added to it. It tweak a little bit the local rules in a way that um, gets them to where they need. And that's the really interesting part to me. And yeah, so I don't know if I answered your question. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think context matters really hugely. And I appreciate the sentiment that biology doesn't respect our boundaries. Val, you had a question
Stop
clarifying
share.
about the randomness. Yeah, good. Let's put the slides down and talk to
Yeah.
each other.
I just was curious if there was like a force that was when this with the sunflowers specifically, that there was like a sweet spot of randomness or noise introduced, and what that actually like looked like. Was there like a intervention to introduce that randomness or noise, or was it just
So the noise is actually built in the system. Through eons of evolution, the thought is that the plants maybe evolved ways to help them achieve the minimization of shading. Are you asking more about the physical process? So how is the force implemented in the biomechanics of the plant?
yeah, and
Yeah.
how do you know like which ones are going to get that zigzag pattern? Like what what leads to the ones getting that pattern?
So we think it's the noise that is helping them get there, in plus some repulsion forces between the plants. So basically, when I mentioned that a plant can tell that it's being shaded by another plant, and when it's doing that, it's actually going to grow away from that shade. So the combination of the what we would refer as repulsion from the shade and the random noise, and actually just the right combination, so you cannot have too much of each, would allows the plants to reach the zigzag pattern.
Okay. I guess just what is the random noise?
The random, okay, so the way that a plant is a really interesting system because it kind of has this memory of the past of where it was. It's hard to, but it can control on where it's going to grow next. And the way it's growing next is there's an internal mechanism in the inside the cells of the plant that are sensitive to light, and then they basically you know direct the plant to towards where to grow next. And then that process can be noisy. So basically what it means is that sometimes this process is taking into account where the light is coming from or where the shade is coming from, and sometimes not.
Mm.
And it's implemented in the molecular biophysical mechanisms of the cells.
Wow. Super cool.
All right, we have a question on signal theory from Shanwan.
Yeah, hi, thanks. I guess I'm just thinking around like recently there's been discourse about like technology like AI destroying like the mechanisms of trust in costly signals because like the effort to make something that is a signal that um previously would have taken a lot of effort, like a well-written essay or something, is now much lower. and how that like influx of new signals at lower cost can disrupt sort of like networks of trust, and wondering if there's any correlation like on an ecosystemic level, thinking about like pesticides that are made from plant compounds, or even like the proliferation of monoculture and how that might affect like interactions between species. Um, and yeah, just wondering if there is like any sense within the work that you're doing about like how to maybe preserve valuable signals, or um, what markers of like accumulated evolutionary like costly signaling are, and where that leads to like yeah better functioning ecosystems or interspecies trust.
Yeah, wow, very interesting. I don't think that my lab is working directly on trust in that sense, although it's really interesting. And the I know that for the bees, for example, when they communicate with the waggle dance, they seem to trust the opinion that is coming from another forager within the committee. But there's one example that is related to fireflies that maybe is touching on the issue of trust here, and that's so I told you that there's many species of fireflies. Every species has a unique pattern, but there are some cheaters. So there are some species of fireflies where the females would mimic the flash pattern of a female from a different species, and then they would lure their males, and then eat them, which is kind of harsh. But it's that sense of from the perspective of these males, do they trust the signal that is coming from what appears to be a female from their own species? Um, and I think this is also tying into maybe a broader theme of the cost of the signals that you also mentioned, which is um, every time a firefly flash, it is becoming a bit more um, prone to predation. So there's that. How do you balance minimizing the number of flashes or the duration that the lantern is on with the ability of other conspecifics being able to recognize you? And on top of that, make sure that you're not landing on, a cheater that is aggressively mimicking the patterns of your own species. I think it's in interesting directions, and I don't have, more answers than this, but maybe I'm happy to think about this more.
Thank you.
Ben K with a meta question.
Sure. So I'm just trying to think of method here. And I guess this is a question just for everyone to chip in, because all these examples and nature-based approaches to design are very enchanting. But if we're here thinking about how to design social systems involving collectives of people, then how do we go about choosing or drawing on these examples? What are the best exemplars? What are the right criteria that we go in order to see what's required? What are because there's normativity and human values involved. So are we going in and choosing things that kind of reinforce and confirm our prior values, or how much of a blank slate or a blank sheet of paper are we going in, looking at these examples and learning from them? So are we learning, or are we just reinforcing what we already know? How do we go about drawing on what nature can tell us about designs that's relevant to our interest in governance?
Yeah, that is the question. Nathan, Val, did you?
No, I'm curious if you have any thoughts. I mean, like, do we want to be more like bees or fireflies?
I think there are some aspects of bees, for example, that I think would be great if human societies would be closer to. For example, the concept of misinformation is so misinformation in the sense that, you know, a bee goes foraging and it's coming back with some information about a really good food source or a nest. If it's not really good, then it's the opinion of this bee is going to very quickly be suppressed by other bees that sort of know better. And in this case, we have a ground truth because there's actually some very specific characteristics that bees look for when they search for a home. And you know, just one example of maybe something that the bees are doing maybe slightly better than human online interaction. But yeah, I'm totally open to suggestions if there's you know, maybe a stronger way to take some of these elements from insect societies and in plant societies and apply them in a constructive way to humans.
I think there's a there are some comments from like Martin and Benjamin. I wonder if either of you want to share those verbally before we move on to the next questions.
I had a quick, I guess, just response or something that Ben's question made me think about, which was like, as a leader or like organizer of this like digital collective that is Metagov, like I think a lot about how information gets like passed around to everyone in the collective and like what are I don't know, the bees and like the pheromone kind of analogy is not going to be able to leave my mind now, and thinking about how key information or like even trends sort of dispel across like a digital group, that it really can go from like person to person in that way, or like you're receiving information from like one or like a trusted collect like small group, and then you're passing that on to like your trusted people, and it can be as yeah, it often is as just like direct as that, you know? This key piece of information that one person has is being like passed along to either person by person or like small group by small group, but then ultimately that informs like a much larger group over time. But yeah, I don't know. I guess like I think of it more in this close context of like Metagov than I do about like big social media networks and trends like across a larger group. I can understand it more at the level and scale of Metagov and see it happening at the scale of Metagov way easier than I think I can see it happen at those larger scales. I mean, partly because of like the closed source versus open source nature, but also just as my position too, as the like community leader, I can see, I think I have that perspective a little bit, maybe more than others.
I think that actually speaks to this question from Mitchie on communication and computation. Do you want to give voice to that?
Sorry, which question? I'm having troubles following
sorry, I was inviting
text.
Mitchie
Oh,
to ask.
okay. Yeah. Yeah, so my question was just, do you see a clear difference between communication and computation? I'm currently reading this book. Oh, it blurred out. What is Intelligence? The filter's blurring
Okay.
out. But maybe if I get my face close up. No. Blaise Iguariakis. I totally butchered his name, but there's a lot of parallels, I think, between what you were talking about and the stuff that he's been writing about. And yeah, I just bring it back to my question. I want to know, like, what is that difference that you see between communication and computation? Are they different, or are they basically the same?
They could be the same. So in both cases you have problem solving, I think that in addition to the communication that I'm talked about here, we also, if we think about the intelligence of the entire system, one important component is the environment. So sometimes, I can think of a few examples where the communication alone doesn't get you to solve the problem. Sorry, I'm going to revert back a little bit. I thought about it as I was talking. So in addition to communication, you have decision making. So communication is one part of the solving this collective problem. One individual is communicating to another, but then that probably both of these individuals need to make a decision about what to do next. And what to do next can be communicating something else to another individual. It could also be something else. It could be move around in the space in a way that helps them construct um, clumps of bees, for example. It can also be decision about to deposit a little piece of wax somewhere that eventually helps them construct their beautiful honeycombs. But that's all in addition to communication. So I think I would make the distinction there.
Cool, thank you.
Sent, do you want to, you've got a couple of comments in there. Do you want to give a voice to those? Okay.
Mine were mostly comments, but I can frame it as a question. Orit,
sounds great.
Have you read any literature on quantum decision theory, where sometimes groups making decisions can display like surprising behaviors that are sort of like the interference patterns from photons in the double slit experiment? If not, it'd be fascinating to hear, to have that incorporated here, and I'll put a link to one of the papers in the chat.
Please put a link. I'm familiar with some, basics of quantum mechanics and the coexistence of states, etc. But I'm curious about how this could integrate into a collective decision process. Thank you.
Great. I think we're open for musings. Pat Kahn or others Rosalind, others who've pitched in the chat. Do you want to share thoughts that are coming up for you?
Hakon, I love your musing. It's beautiful. If you don't want to say it, then everyone should read it.
I could. I was like, oh, no, these emoji reacting, but you had. I was like, like I said, it makes me. It's an anxious thought. But yeah, I guess someone brought up like aligning natural systems, governance systems with natural systems, and I think the fear that I have sometimes is like, but what if nature demonstrates persistence of structures that at many scales that run counter to our human values and ethics? Do we say, fuck you, universe, Western human values for the win, we are superior, or do we try to thoughtfully like align or think hard about how to align individual and collective values with the way the universe seems to favor? Yeah, and I mostly think the universe seems to align with liberal thought in interesting ways that like reassure me. But every once in a while, I'll see something like, oh shit, like we're just a bunch of hierarchies, a bunch of intense hierarchies, like stomping around the world. But I know there's also like, yeah, we're just the hierarchies are what speak. We talk. Our language comes from the hierarchy, but there are other orders that are among us. So that, I don't know. Anyway, sorry, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I think about this a lot. Just like browsing human politics, which is hard to avoid these days, and thinking about, for example, invasive species and how biodiversity communities are treating, these potential problems that they can cause to other existing species. And are our human values and ethics directly map to what happens in nature in that sense?
Thanks. I hope.
hope,
yeah, it would be nice to just be able to trust ourselves.
Are there any last thoughts that folks want to bring up? I'm curious if Orit, if you've seen cases where your work has been used for kind of biomimicry kinds of applications where people have like companies approached you asking like, can we apply the bee protocol to our product? Have you seen these kinds of applications emerge, with your work or others' work?
Yeah.
What does that look like or feel like?
Yeah, there's a lot of biomimicry implemented, I think, in robotics. So people are trying to create distributed network of robots that make decisions, that maybe forage together. I don't have much direct connection to these, but recently, maybe a few recent examples that I think are going this way. I have a new collaboration with a few folks at CU Boulder and outside of CU Boulder, where we're trying to take the food sharing principles that we learned from bees and implement them on electric cars. Because it's a similar process, right? You have to charge. You need to have a battery, and then if there's a way to in a case of emergency to share some of these some of the battery with a different individual, or maybe have these what we would refer to as food source in our experiment. We can have some battery distribution system that better distributed the energy between individuals. And then a really fun recent thing that another recent, taking something we learned from fireflies in this case and try to apply it to the search of extraterrestrial life. So if we think about this is a collaboration with Sarah Walker from ASU, and they have access to a lot of pulsar data in the universe, and the question is, can we detect some not flash pattern but pulse patterns that are coming from the universe in a way that would imply that they were intelligently designed by something. So I love these. I love when something we learned about insects or plants can be helpful in other interesting fields. So I'm very open to suggestions if you have thoughts about how to apply to governance.
Well, thank you so much. We're at the end of our hour. Let's take a moment to unmute in a few seconds and share our applause and see if we can trick the Zoom algorithm so we can hear some synchronicity. But thank you so much for a fabulous conversation. 3, 2, 1, go.
Woohoo! Yeah.
Thank you all so much.
Grazie.
All right.
Bye, Bo.
Take care, y'all. Until next time.
Later.
Everyone, have a great day.
Bye.
Thanks for hosting and speaking.
Thanks, Orit.